And welcome back to Brothers of the Arcana. As always, I am Alex Aldea.
I am co-host Dave Ferrigno.
And with us, we have
Chuck Dunning.
Chuck Dunning, who's a friend of the show and just a lovely human being that I've had a chance to work with a little bit one-on-one and a little bit in community settings, and certainly through his wonderful books. Just a little bit about Chuck. He is a Freemason with a deep commitment to contemplative practices within the Masonic tradition. He's also a huge contributor and a part of the Scottish Rite, Southern jurisdiction, I believe, right, Chuck?
That's right.
And the Knight Commander of the Court of Honor, and as well as creating the Academy of Reflection. We could talk a little bit about that. We had Randy Sanders on the show, who's a buddy of yours and a buddy of ours, and just a wonderful, wonderful human being. And you have a little bit of I should say, a large background in the mental health and counseling spaces. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you're interested in chatting about that, and get a better sense of your expertise in meditation and such. I've read recently, and I got a copy for Dave too, of Rosicrucian Oratory, which is just, man, it's a tour de force. I mean, it's such a complete system primer idea of how to be contemplative esoteric within the larger Christian context, which I think is something that is so needed in Christianity today. Because I don't know, I go to some of my friends' churches, and you probably see some of this down in Texas. A lot of evangelicals. You go to church, they start out with a sort of a rock concert kind of a thing, and then the guy does a homily for about 40 minutes, and then there's another rock concert, and you're on your way. They give you an coffee, whatever. Sometimes they give you your own single serving of communion, which you give to yourself, and that's just, I don't know if that's right or wrong. I just know it's not for me. Whatever that is, it's just almost strangely alien to me in terms of the idea of communal practice and esotericism and what Christianity really means. And I'm totally ripping you off from now on. I am also a Christian esotericist. After I read that book, I said, I'm that too. So thank you so much for being on the show and for joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm really pleased that book has been so meaningful to you. I hope that it's useful in lots of ways. And one of the things that is important to me is not only reaching out to Freemasons, but reaching out to Christians who are looking for a deeper experience of their tradition. While I'm very much an esoteric Christian, I also value the presence of non-Christians in these traditions like Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, and have personally benefited from the presence of non-Christians in those traditions. And so I do want to make that clear that we're not talking about something exclusive here when we share our particular passion for the mysteries in a Christian sense.
I appreciate that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I firmly believe there's just one mountain and many, many paths that sort of go up it. And it all just depends on how you choose to walk that path. What inspired you to explore the contemplative side of, first of all, of Christianity and of Freemasonry? And how did that journey sort of begin for you?
I'll try not to make this my life story.
3 sentences or less, Chuck. Thank you. Appreciate
it. Even as a kid, I mean, I grew up in a very religious family. We lived right next door to the church that we all went to, that my parents helped to found and develop. And we all in time held leadership positions in the church. And I always just had a naturally kind of mystical orientation. Part of that was due to having really been taken by some particular unusual experiences of consciousness. I started lucid dreaming at the age of 9. I had other unusual experiences and what you might call extraordinary kinds of experiences of consciousness as a kid. And those always gave me the sense that there's more to the story than I was being told. When I prayed, I felt like there was more going on than me just kind of, confessing my sins and asking God for help, that there was some kind of connection that was happening. And even when I didn't feel that, I felt a strong desire for that. And at a very young age, single digit years.
Sure.
And so I was just kind of naturally predisposed to that. And then later, when I got older and started reading some books on comparative religion and everything, and particularly when I started reading the Upanishads, which are just like in your face about connecting with the divine and having that immediate knowledge of the divine, I thought, yeah, that's what I want. And then later in my 20s, when I was in college, I had a philosophy professor that was teaching a course in esoteric philosophy. And he also taught non-credit seminars in contemplative practice. And that's when my practice moved into something that was really kind of structured and intentional. And I was getting some teaching about it. It wasn't just, okay, how can I pray deeper, or how can I try to approximate what I'm reading about in all these books that mention meditation? So yeah, those are the bullet points.
So Chuck, from that perspective, you mentioned lucid dreaming. What role would you say that plays in spiritual work then?
I think it varies from individual to individual. I know that there are some people who have found it central to their spirituality and their spiritual practices. I found it central to the formation of my relationship with quote unquote reality, with existence. And there was a time when I consciously worked at lucid dreaming and was able to do it willfully to a certain degree. But after a while, I kind of just had the sense that I had pretty much gotten everything I needed to get out of that, and that it wasn't something that I needed to sustain as an ongoing practice. It still happens, but I'm not working at it the way that I used to. And it can be different for different people. Some people never lucid dream, no matter how hard they work at it, no matter what tricks they use to try to stimulate lucid dreams. It just never happens for them. And I would not say that automatically means that they're limited in some way regarding what's possible for their spiritual development.
Did you, would lucid dreaming have anything to do with astral projection at all? And if so, does it have anything to do with the Monroe Institute idea of that astral projection?
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting intersections to be discussed there. So first of all, I would differentiate between astral projection and astral travel. For me, astral projection has to do, goes more along the lines of what we might call remote viewing. So it's the consciousness dissociating from the physical body and being able to travel through space and possibly even time to see things, places where the physical body isn't. Astral travel is really more about engaging like otherworldly landscapes in the mind. I mean, think using your imagination, creating scenery and characters to interact with in the imagination. And astral travel and lucid dreaming can be almost identical. When astral travel is done in really deep concentration and focus, my experience is that one loses consciousness of their body, their sense perceptions, and I'm just in there really tuned into that imagery, and spontaneous things are happening the way they do in dreams. And of course, I can take control and influence them and completely change them if I want to, like can happen in lucid dreams. But there's still this kind of immersion and recognition that, yeah, my consciousness is just in a different world right now.
It's fascinating to hear about that kind of stuff. I haven't been able to do it myself. I've experienced something similar while doing ayahuasca, or some of the sort of psychedelic stuff that I found myself doing in my misspent youth and in my misspent older age. But again, that's something that's sort of doing it for you, right? So it's holding the space on your behalf, rather than you doing the work of doing that. So I guess there's another discipline there. There's another probably mechanism that has to be worked on, a muscle that has to be trained to some extent.
Yeah, that's right. And there are lots of really good techniques there are basically three kinds of things that need to be developed. One is you need to learn how to be able to relax really, really, really deeply, and be able to do that consistently, at will. And number two, you need to be able to concentrate very well and be able to hold concentration. And number three, you need to be able to generate imagery through the use of your imagination to generate very specific, clear imagery, and using your powers of concentration, hold on to that imagery. And a good course of development will help you build those skills so that eventually what can happen is that degree of spontaneity where you begin to interact with things like you would in a dream. Characters can speak to you and do things without you telling them what to say, without you thinking ahead of time, this is what that character needs to do. And that's a talent that some people have, and it kind of comes to them a little more naturally. But most people have to work at it to some degree to kind of get to that level of experience.
Go ahead, Dave, because I know you had a question about sort of systematizing some of this stuff.
Yeah. Would you say, to the point you're making, some people it comes naturally, but if it doesn't come naturally, would you recommend the Monroe Institute, or what kind of recommendations would you make, or modalities to use? Because I think, especially nowadays, there's so many things that distract an individual. You look around your house, it's not like your phone's going off, the TV, your neighbors, your dog, whatever else, everything could distract you. So how do you maintain and create that level of concentration and discipline to get there?
Yeah. Well, it's like any other art or science, you've got to practice it. You have got to set aside time, and you've got to devote energy to practicing it. Yeah, some of these things like, binaural beat technology, like used by the Monroe Institute, and some of the various apps that are out there that you can use on your phone, entheogens, those kinds of things can assist you in slipping into those kinds of states of consciousness. But to Alex's point earlier, they don't really help you develop that muscle very much. Can they make it easier to pass through the door sometimes? Yeah. Once you've experienced it, once you've kind of been there and you know what that's like, it can be easier to get there again. But there's no substitute for actually developing the strengths and abilities through repeated, consistent practice.
Okay, so that sort of begs the question as to what is the right path here to develop that repeated, consistent practice, and how do we get there?
Yeah. That's a good question. And I think you're just going to get different answers depending upon which tradition that you're looking at, which school, even within a particular tradition. They're going to typically, a well-developed system or school is going to provide you a series of lessons and exercises to work through that will get you there. And in some schools, you're going to find some differences from others. They're going to emphasize some things and de-emphasize the others. But I will say this, is that any system or school that doesn't begin with developing the skills of relaxation and concentration is presenting a serious shortcoming for their students, because those are the real cornerstones for any kind of consistent, stable, disciplined inner work.
So there's a couple different things that you reference in your book, and let's just take Rosicrucian Oratory since it's the most recent and the freshest on my mind anyway. Although I have read Contemplative Masonry and several others of yours, and I've enjoyed them tremendously. Rosicrucianism is certainly one of the forefront ideas, and so how does the tradition of Rosicrucianism? Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to best ask my question here, because Rosicrucianism is, first of all, it's a bunch of traditions, right? So, and even from the manifestos, was there really a Christian Rosencrantz? Is that even relevant to the modern day? Whether there was or not, part of the Rosicrucianism has now gone into the Scottish Rite. Part of it is within the Masonry. Part of it's outside of Masonry, and does that even matter in terms of the practices and everything else? People don't have to be Masons to be Rosicrucians. Go.
Okay, Alex. Honestly, I kind of, in trying to follow you there, I kind of got lost from the original question. So
excellent. That makes two of us. All right. So I guess my question,
actually, three of us.
Yeah, perfect. Dave too. Rosicrucianism is a modality to establish this sort of contemplative practice. If you're so willing to use it, I suppose, as that modality. How does it sort of work within that space? How can you get there through that? And then we'll go through a couple of other esoteric traditions, like we did with Mark Stavish, just to try to get a sense of different possibilities for folks that may want to think about that.
Well, you find as much variability just within the broad scope of Rosicrucianism as you do within the entire scope of Western esotericism, and maybe even wider in some cases than Western esotericism in general. So you have magical Rosicrucian schools. They're really focused on ceremonial magic, and not just the external ritual work, but also the internal magical processes, the high magic. And you have Rosicrucian orders that are more mystical in orientation. They're really focused on that devotional kind of experience that comes through loving the divine with everything that you are, and through a process of mystical realization, recognizing your unity, your oneness with the divine, and everything else. So you've got the magical, and you've got the mystical. You've also got the more of a kind of psychological orientation within Rosicrucianism that really kind of is oriented towards personal development and kind of becoming as self-aware in a psychological way as possible, and improving yourself as a member of society in ways kind of like Freemasonry does. And then there are also manifestations of Rosicrucianism that are just philosophical. It's just intellectual, period. They're not interested in so much in like really trying to change, develop, improve any aspect of your being other than just gaining kind of intellectual knowledge and historical knowledge and that sort of thing, which also bears some similarities to things that happen in Freemasonry.
Okay. What about Martinism as a general principle? Is that, because I know that deals a little bit more with reintegration, right, rather than from that as a general rule. I mean, it's, as a contemplative school, I guess it's out there, right? In terms of that, can you shed a little bit of light in that respect, as far as from your research and stuff?
Yeah, I would say again, there's some variability there. Maybe not quite. I would say not as much as we see in the broad scope of Rosicrucianism, but I mean, there are Martinist orders that really do tend a little bit more towards a kind of a magical practice that, they're really heavily connected with the Elu Kohen tradition, and they see them as complementary and even necessary complements to each other. Then you have more mystical forms of Martinism where people are really genuinely doing inner work that is focused on this kind of devotional experience of the divine and coming into greater harmony with that, which we could speak of in terms of reintegration. And of course, there's a magical perspective on what reintegration means too. And so, but at some point, those two, I do think they do complement each other. And then within Martinism, there are also plenty of Martinist orders and groups out there that are essentially just fraternal organizations that have a more spiritual kind of atmosphere to them. And that's about it. That's, they're just maybe like a more spiritualized form of Freemasonry. And yet what they all have in common, just as all Rosicrucian traditions ultimately kind of go back to the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding, all Martinist traditions trace their root back to Saint Martin and his realization that this deeper contemplative approach to the divine of recognizing one's own personal connection with the divine deeply within, that was the most essential practice. Saint Martin makes that clear. I know that there are some people that argue this point, but to me, it seems clear that Saint Martin had kind of had enough of the complexity of what happened in the Elu Kohen and said, I think that there's a more direct way to get where it is that I want to go and to know what it is that I want to know, and to become what it is that I want to become. And so I think that that's a common heritage in Martinism.
That's fascinating. And that's a beautiful way to put it. That whole idea of and I think you're talking about the path of the heart kind of thing, right? What he sort of espoused in that. I remember reading about that kind of idea, and it's a very Christian idea in that sense, but it's not just Christian, because obviously, if you want to, it's Sufi, it's Hindi, it's a lot of things. So that's very interesting. Getting more into what about stuff like Golden Dawn or OTO or other things like that? We talked about that with Stavish. So, especially OTO, and then getting into the left-hand path stuff. And this was a question that sort of came up with another brother who was OTO, and he mentioned that he was. And he said, well, that's my path towards enlightenment, I guess, or whatever. Is it? Can you have a left-hand path towards enlightenment? Is that even possible?
Yeah, well, I think you'd have to do an entire episode on what do you mean by the left-hand path.
I suppose.
Because there really are lots of different viewpoints on that. I mean, it's almost like you're not going to find any two people that are going to agree down to the nth detail on what the left-hand path is. But if we talk about it in the sense of kind of a rejection of authority, is often part of the left-hand path. It's like, I'm not going to be subject to institutions, to systems, to traditions telling me what I should think and shouldn't think and presenting me with dogma and doctrine. And I'm more interested in developing my own divinity to its highest point rather than having this devotional relationship with the divine. But that kind of left-hand path can ironically lead a person into a realization of their oneness with the divine, despite their own resistance to it. Now, I know that there are plenty of people out there who consider themselves left-hand path practitioners that would say what I've just described as the left-hand path is inaccurate. It certainly doesn't fit what they practice and what they experience. And I want to say that I have got some very dear friends that regard themselves as left-hand path practitioners who are genuinely loving, caring, compassionate, insightful human beings who have a great depth of spiritual insight and wisdom. So while I don't regard myself as a left-hand path practitioner, I don't really regard myself as necessarily a right-hand path practitioner. I'm not even going to go in that direction and try to clarify what we mean by that. I see myself as a kind of Christian middle way guy, and Western esotericism middle way guy, and so like is attested in many of the ancient traditions. And like you said at the very beginning, Alex, there are lots of different roads, but there really is only one mountain. There really is only one reality that we're all connected with and trying to understand and trying to make our way with. And just about any path has the potential to bring someone into greater harmony and reintegration, to use that Martinist term, greater oneness and unity with that one reality, that one singular truth.
So, Chuck, there's been a lot of discussion that we've had with several friends, other brothers, individuals. What would you say is the definition of enlightenment? Because it seems like everybody has their own definition, and to the point you're just making, there's different paths and such.
Yeah.
So, in your own words, what would you say it is?
You guys are throwing me some really crazy pitches today. Chuck, left-hand path. Chuck, enlightenment.
Well, you're the expert. Have at
it. Well, maybe the problem is that I've been doing this stuff long enough now that it's just really hard for me to talk about these things without making all kinds of qualifications and and noting exceptions to whatever it is that I'm going to put forward. Yeah. Okay. What is enlightenment? Oh my gosh. I'm just going to speak for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Please do.
So I would say for me personally, there's kind of a ladder of enlightenment that parallels Plato's allegory of the divided line. And each step up that line, moving from what he called acacia into pistis, and from pistis into dianoia, and from dianoia into noesis, is a progression of enlightenment. And And the language that Plato used was that this is our progression toward knowing what is really real. And he says that which is really real transcends all of these other ways of using our consciousness. Acacia meaning just really basically being enmeshed within our sensory perceptions and our cultural conditioning. Kind of living in the
man of the torrent kind of thing.
Yes, to use that Martinist language, that person is basically just kind of operating on autopilot with all of the programming that they've been received and taking for granted that their physical perceptions, what they see, what they hear, what they smell and taste and touch, is exactly what reality is. That there's no difference between reality and what they perceive through their senses and what they've been taught to believe about what they perceive through their senses.
Sure.
And so then you move from that to what he would call dianoia, from that visible realm where you have acacia and pistis into dianoia. And dianoia is where we start to use the processes of discursive reasoning and critical thinking to test and recognize, oh, well, crap, there's a lot of stuff going on here that doesn't make logical sense. The things that I thought were true are not necessarily true. The things that I was taught to believe are not necessarily accurate. And I can't always trust my senses. If I really test things in a kind of scientific, rational way, logical way, I find out that my senses are misleading often. And boy, hasn't, modern physics begun to reveal that in great depth. And so then when you realize that even logical reasoning has its limits, that there's something that logical reasoning can't touch, but it can point in the direction of, that logical reasoning can lead us to a place where we can say, yeah, there's something more. There's something else. And what is it that gets you there? Well, Plato says that's noesis, what he would call direct intuition. And it involves recognizing that we, at the level of consciousness that we identify with, we actually receive things from someplace else. And in these moments that transcend space and time, that cannot be explained or limited in terms of sensory perceptions and logical use of language, because language is dualistic inherently. Mm-hmm. And that's when we're having our clearest perception of the real. And that's what I would say, that's when we're having we're reaching into the highest levels of enlightenment.
Thank you for that. So when you talk about that journey up the ladder, do you believe, or would you say that there's almost gatekeepers, like metaphysical gatekeepers, that are kind of preventing somebody from ascending to the next rung of the ladder? Or is that more on the mental side, that somebody's just unconsciously blocking themselves?
Yeah. No, my personal perspective is that there are beings that are not physical, that inhabit other realms or levels of existence / consciousness, and that we're interacting with them all the time, and that very often our psychological processes and those beings are contacting each other. So when we...
Did you say our psychological processes?
Yep. Our psychological processes and those non-physical beings are in contact with each other often.
How does that
Maybe
work?
all the time.
I mean, in the sense of like, I would have thought our spiritual processes maybe or such. So, but that's fascinating. Do you get a sense of how that works?
Well, I can talk about some examples.
Sure.
So, in one model of the manifestation of reality, we have the material or physical level of existence. You could call it the plane, the material plane or physical plane. And then just above that, some people would say there's the etheric realm. And then just above that is the astral realm. And the etheric really serves as a connection, a kind of connector between the astral and the physical. And the etheric, we most consciously interact with and experience the etheric in terms of our emotions and in terms of certain sensory kinds of things, certain sensory experiences, but definitely through emotions, and emotions also reach up into the astral.
Okay.
Well, there are beings that exist just within, like, say, the etheric realm. That's where their home is, kind of the way ours appears to be here in the physical world. And so they can have an effect on the energies at that level that can affect our emotions, and our emotions can have an effect on that level that have an effect on them.
Okay, go ahead.
So, for example, one of the metaphysical theories of addiction is that you literally have a kind of etheric monkey on your back. That's an old phrase. I'm dating myself. You don't hear it much anymore.
Right, sure.
You literally have a kind of etheric monkey on your back that feeds off of the energies that are connected with your addiction. That craving, that feeling of satisfaction when you get the high or whatever it is that you're trying to get through your addiction. And all of the tension that's involved in trying to feed that addiction, there are creatures that actually feed off of that energy. And so they're inclined to kind of keep you in the addiction. And this is one of the reasons why things like banishings and exorcisms, for example, can actually have really beneficial results on people. And they may only be short term because you're just kind of pushing these things away for a while to give the person a sense of freedom. Oh, wow. Okay, this is what it feels like to not have that monkey on my back. But, they still have the potential for it coming back in some way often. And so there's always this deep inner work that has to be done for true healing and overcoming your susceptibility. Now, that's a real negative example of the kind of relationship we can have with non-physical beings. There are very positive examples as well. We talk a lot about spirit guides, for example. That's a real popular term in kind of New Age spirituality and in some more ancient traditions. Some people think of the Holy Guardian Angel, for example, as a truly separate entity who watches over us and influences us and guides us towards fulfillment of our potentials. So, yes, I do believe and am convinced that there are other entities apart from our own individual being that we interact with all the time without even realizing it.
Fascinating.
I pay attention to a guy named Angelo DeLullo. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work at all. He wrote a book called Awake. He's also got a YouTube channel called Simply Always Awake. And he leads people through contemplative practice. I don't know if you'd call it contemplative. I guess he probably would fit somewhat under that moniker. Keeps pointing the way towards a non-dual state, right? Yeah. Ideally, a persistent non-dual state, beginning with Kensho or Satori, and then moving into that ladder of enlightenment from there. So that's more of the Eastern idea of how to do that, right? So he comes from a Zen practice. I think he was he was a student of Adyashanti and that sort of tradition. I've had sparks of that breaking through. Haven't been able to keep it though. As of yet, would love to. But that's a pretty cool thing. Getting back to addiction for a second though, I had a friend of mine that is I mean, he's a white guy from Michigan, but he's been down in the Amazon for a while, studying to be a shaman, and learning the songs, going through all the ceremonies and everything. And he had a friend of his that a girl had some addiction issues, and literally when he was studying with the plants, and this wasn't necessarily hallucinogenic plants, it wasn't ayahuasca, it was more like Nuya Rao or Bobinsana, Kiriksanango, some of the plants that were endemic of the area, which are usually activated through meditation, contemplation, and tobacco at some point. But he saw in one of his meditations, he saw very clearly there was like a big insect sort of thing feeding on her spirit. And it was like this sort of a, creature that it knew that, she had this addiction, and it was just plain as day that was something that was happening. So, she had to go through a fair amount of stuff to rid herself of these things. And I don't know if she's done it fully or completely, but that's an interesting thing. Can you talk about the whole idea of how to achieve that first bout? I guess if you want to go the Greek route, right, of the line, or the idea of hitting Kensho and keeping it, of attaining a persistent non-duality, if that's the first real step towards enlightenment, or really that's your ticket into the game of living on a high, on a whole different level. Is there a way that you know of or have practiced that can get you there?
There are lots of things that can get you there, and sometimes it can happen without you even consciously trying to invoke it, or evoke it. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Is I think it was Father Thomas Keating, who's kind of regarded as the figurehead of the contemplative prayer movement that has happened, that began in the 20th century, as an expression, a newer expression of a much older tradition in Christianity. The centering prayer method is what he taught, and others like Cynthia Bourgeault. I think one of the things he said one time was, look, all of our practices don't make the unitive experience happen. That transcendent moment of oneness, of non-duality, they don't make it happen. They just prepare you for it. All your inner work just prepares you for that. And I would say that the preparation is, on the one hand, makes you more open and receptive to that kind of an experience, that kind of a realization or knowing. And on the other hand, it prepares you for what comes after that moment of realization or knowing, so that you can more completely integrate it into who you are and live in harmony with that truth at deeper levels. And so there, like I said, there are lots of things that can get you there, lots of practices. My personal recommendation, particularly for people from Christian background, is that they learn about centering prayer. There are also other methods of using chant, for example, that are very powerful. I love chant. It's one of my favorite practices. And it's something that's fairly universal. It's not just, restricted to any particular place on the globe or any particular religious tradition, although it's done differently in different traditions and different locations. But the power of the voice and the vibration that happens through the voice has an effect, I think, on our nervous systems that helps open us up to the greater possibility of this moment of knowing or realization. And then, like we were talking earlier, I think there are entheogens. There are people that experience that through the use of entheogens. But then we get back to this question of how do you stabilize that?
Right.
And that's where the really sound background in religious and philosophical wisdom comes in. The importance of virtues, the importance of self-awareness, of examining yourself and being honest with yourself about, how your mind really works and what you do and do not have control over, and what your strengths and weaknesses are, what your vices are, which virtues may become more naturally to you. That really kind of deep, probing, psychological, moral inventory, to use the language of the 12 steps, is a really important practice, because those are the kinds of things that help stabilize the realization of non-duality, of oneness, and to bring it into everyday life, so that, yes, I'm still participating in the dualistic world, but I understand now and can behave in a way that reflects the reality that it's all interwoven, it's all interconnected, it's all part of this one thing, and so are you. And when you start relating to reality and other human beings that way, well, my word for that is love. And for me, that's what happens in a truly stabilized realization of non-duality, is you just become completely, much more enmeshed in love. You realize you're an embodiment of love. Everything's an embodiment of love. The relationships that's happening between things, that's love too. The reason all of this is here to begin with is love. Yeah. So to me, then, that's what characterizes the stability of someone's realization. Now, having said that, I'm not in the position to judge anybody else's stability and their realization.
Right.
I'm just telling you what my experience has been personally, and what I have seen in the people that I have recognized as being most, quote unquote, enlightened.
So do you see paradoxes as like a stepping stone, or is it something that people need to resolve on their journey, to enlightenment? Like, how would you describe that?
That's a great question, Dave. And you took me right back to a big part of the work with my very first teacher. He was a philosophy professor, as I told you before, and he just was really strong in Greek philosophy, in particular Platonism and Pythagoreanism. And I remember when he introduced me to Zeno's paradoxes. One of the famous ones is essentially, it breaks down like this. In order for me to walk all the way across the room, I have to first walk at least half of that distance. Well, in order for me to walk at least half of that distance, I have to walk at least a half of that distance. And so on and so on. And you get this infinite regression that mathematically says you can't ever get there. Because what you realize is there's actually an infinite distance between where I am and where that other place seems to be, right? Well, if you're working within a dualistic framework, then you've got to say, okay, well, this is just a meaningless word game, or it's it's truly a paradox because it's unresolvable. And those have been the two answers, essentially, that most Western philosophers have been satisfied with. But if you have a non-dualist perspective, if you've had a moment of non-dualistic awakening, you can say, oh, that's just an illusory set of conditions or symptoms that's brought about by the appearance of two dimensions within a single unitary reality. That space and time are just mechanisms of duality. They're not absolutes themselves.
So would you say that time then, would time be linear, cyclical? Is it entirely different than what we understand or grasp them?
It doesn't exist.
From this perspective of non-dualism, time is just one of the illusions. It's one of the most fundamental illusions. And it's an important one, and it's one that we need to have a good relationship with. Don't get me wrong. When I talk about things in the dualistic experience as being illusory, please don't misunderstand that means I think they're meaningless, that they're worthless, that that we need to just be getting over them and getting away from them as quickly as possible. I'm not advocating some sort of spiritual suicide here. So what I think is that time is an illusion, and that from higher perspectives of consciousness and being, so we were talking about those other beings, that there are levels of being and consciousness at which time is like, it's no more lineal and prescriptive to those levels of existence than the three dimensions of space are to us. We can move freely about in the three dimensions of space. And so I believe that there's a level of consciousness and being at which it's possible to move freely through time. And I think that there's some evidence from remote viewing to that effect.
Awesome.
Do you view time as a series of basic, like, static shots that are basically sped up the way a cartoon would be? And then you have the illusion of sort of moving through something, but it's really just, that's the whole idea of remote viewing, right? You capture a snapshot of the future, but if there's a propensity of going there, then in essence, then you can get to that point and that will manifest. But within the field of potentiality, it could just as easily be a different snapshot if circumstances make it so.
Yeah, I have to say, I just have to start by saying I don't know, Alex.
Okay.
I kind of have some problems with the idea of time just being divided up into these static pieces, these really infinitesimally defined static pieces. Because one of the things that suggests is that there's no fluidity in time, and that everything is determined, and that there's no free will. And my experience suggests to me that free will is a reality. It's much different than I think most of us tend to think of what we mean when we say free will. But that there is a reality there in which we are, at least potentially, agents of undetermined change.
So how would you describe free will then?
Yeah. Left-hand path, enlightenment, free will.
Yeah.
Just throwing all the zingers at you today.
Okay, so one of the things that I have said from time to time is we don't have free will. Free will has us.
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That when we try to think of free will, so I guess in a way, what I'm going to be doing is taking the via negativa approach on free will, what it is not. It's not just a matter of using our usual thought processes to consider options and then pick one.
Yes.
Right? We can, through, not too deep a reflection, recognize how most of us can recognize how we're predisposed to make certain choices, and to prefer some things over others. And in that extent, in that way, we can say that, just the process of making choice is largely kind of a mechanistic, just kind of working out of different factors influencing each other within our consciousness and then being channeled back out into the world through us. That's not free will. So that's not free will. What I'm talking about as free will is like those, we were talking about those moments of transcendence where something just kind of enters your consciousness out of nowhere. At least nowhere that you're immediately aware of, right? And that creative spark that you had no control over, that's closer to what I would call an experience and an expression. It's an experience of free will. And then when you try to give it form, then that's an expression of free will. And you're just the instrument of it. You didn't own any of that process until, you decided, oh, I'm going to respond to that. And I'm going to try to do something with that. That's when it starts to express itself. So free will has us. We don't have it. It's
fascinating.
It's beyond our personal level of existence.
One of my horrible frustrations is you do a little confessing here, if I could, Father Chuck,
Is that
Bless you, my child.
yes, absolutely. Is that and I talked to a buddy of mine, Kenny, who I hope to have on the podcast too. Just a wonderful guy. He's a music producer, now developer, but he's lived his entire life by tapping into his third eye and putting decisions to it and then getting an answer, whatever it is. Another friend of ours, Mark, is a very contemplative guy. He uses the heart, right? He says he goes all the way down to the bottom of the heart where it's the quietest place in the body. And he's able to access that quiet and to be led by it, right? And, it's both the same. I had them both in the same room yesterday, and they're both talking to me like, Alex, use the third eye. Alex, use the heart. I was like, I can't go to either of those places, and I'm trying to be guided by something other than my own ego, which isn't working out for me, let me tell you. It's frustrating that I can't quite get to these quiet places. And obviously, as you say, the first step is relaxing. I find that extremely hard to do. So for guys like me, and I'm sure there must be other guys out there, they're like, well, all you have to do is just meditate. Yeah, but I just can't get there. I can't get to, there's places in my body that don't actually ever relax. So like, how do I get to the point where I can relax deeply if I can't relax deeply?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, and I don't, please don't misinterpret my tone here.
Sure.
One of the first things you have to do is stop saying I can't, Alex.
Okay.
This is one of the hard lessons I had to learn, and that's why I'm speaking to you the way that I am, is that part of my conditioning was to say that, that there were things that I can't do that. That's actually, from a psychological point of view, and particularly from a Jungian point of view, that's how we create the shadow, is by saying I can't to things, either because we think it's wrong or because we think it's beyond us in some way, that we don't have the talent or the ability. And so when we say that, when we talk to ourselves like that, we're pushing some potential farther out beyond our reach, behind us, into the shadow. And so I would just beg you to be really, really careful and try to catch yourself in talking that way.
Okay.
Now, I also want to be empathetic and recognize that you've obviously made some really serious efforts to try to relax and practice relaxation. And I'll have to acknowledge that, they're like with anything else, there are going to be human beings somewhere on a bell curve with regard to this ability.
Sure.
And so most people are going to be in the middle of that bell curve. Some people are going to be at the extreme end of talent and ability for this, and others are going to be at the end of really being challenged in this way. But wherever you are on that bell curve, you can develop and refine the ability in some way. And so the question is, how does that happen? And there are lots of different methods of doing that. And sometimes it's just a process of trial and error until you find something that really works for you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that was really, really helpful to me when I was trying to learn to relax and what relaxation was really like was I was working in a drug and alcohol rehab as a technician. I wasn't a therapist yet. And one of the therapists there knew that I had an interest in meditation and this kind of stuff. And it was just getting started for me. I was just going to this philosophy professor that I was telling you about. We were just developing our relationship, and I was developing this relationship with a therapist. And he said, yeah, I'll teach you how to do this. And he taught me this process of relaxation that was just really, really, really effective. And I learned then how to facilitate that for the residents of the therapeutic program that we were in. And one of the things that I have learned over the years is that having someone guide you through a process of relaxation, a number of times, and helping you learn that, helping you get there, that can be a really important thing. That assistance of another human being can be even more effective and powerful than an app, right? Because the app isn't giving off the kind of energy that the individual human being does.
Sure.
They're not radiating that energy field that the human being does. And an app cannot have the kind of back and forth conversation and reflection with you about what that experience was like and how maybe to tweak it a little bit so that maybe next time it works a little better, or how you can begin to then do it for yourself.
Right.
So this obviously makes the point that I think personal coaching, to use a kind of a business term, is really, really important in this esoteric business.
That's certainly interesting. I have a question. So, what would you say is the true meaning of working on yourself then? And, we were just talking about duality. How does that duality apply while working on yourself? And just to give a little background, I think there's so many times where you see people go through a breakup, or people go through financial hardship, or just life experiences happen, and it really transforms them and causes them to work on themselves. But, to that end, what would you say is the true meaning of working on yourself?
Yeah. I think it's, in one sense, it's as simple as this. It's paying attention to what goes on within you emotionally and mentally. That's it. But its most basic level is just paying attention. And not just assuming that, on the one hand, that's either totally self-directed, that it's not in reaction to anything at all. You're just this totally independent entity that's completely self-determined. So that on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm just this completely manipulated, controlled kind of victim of circumstances.
Well,
right? But to recognize that there's a middle ground in there, that we do have individuality and self-determination, and we do have reactivity to circumstances that is sometimes beyond our awareness and control. But what helps us keep that middle position is what we were talking about earlier, and that is the realization that, oh, wait a second, if I really pay attention to my consciousness, I can recognize moments when something enters into it that isn't just a result of one of those two things.
So with the ego, as Alex floats away over there, because his ego is so big, right? Just kidding. But how would the ego play into that, while working on yourself? Is that something you would recommend? Do you have to essentially take out of the equation altogether? And how would somebody do that?
As long as you're in dualistic consciousness, the ego's there. It may be really, really thin and flimsy and lightweight at some times, and other times be the exact opposite. But to some degree, the ego is always going to be there if you're in duality, because it is that perception of otherness, right? I am something separate, something other, something different from whatever else. And then, of course, a lot of the things that we build up on top of that we typically mean when we're saying ego, like, selfishness and narcissism, those kinds of things, those are built up to help protect and maintain that sense of otherness and disconnectedness. Somehow we've gotten the idea that it's dangerous for that sense of otherness to become thin and lightweight and flimsy, and to recognize our interconnectedness with everything. That's been part of our programming, is to believe that that's dangerous. And there's probably also some natural drive for that as well. It's a combination of nature and nurture. But so the idea of once and for all annihilating the ego and then continuing to exist without an ego while you're in duality, as far as I'm concerned, that's just another illusion. Can a person be free from narcissism and selfishness? Yeah, I think that there have been some human beings who have demonstrated that their ego is so refined and so transparent that there's just no hint of narcissism or selfishness in those human beings. Those are really special human beings to me.
thank you, Chuck. It's nice to be recognized.
Yeah,
absolutely. Now, would you say? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I sort of do, because I think it's a wonderful thing if we could speak it on that level of, like, after your. I say that you experienced an awakening. Would that be fair to say? Throughout your process of on that Kensho level, in other words?
It's fair to say that I've had a number of experiences that I would call non-dual experiences.
Okay. Do you still exhibit a monkey mind in that sense, where thoughts are okay? So that has
not in the moment of those experiences, but coming out of them. Yeah, I still do.
Got it. I'm just trying to sense, because obviously the way that at least DeLillo talks about it, and I guess Adyashanti, at some point, what happens is the way that it's described is after the Kensho, when it sticks, quote unquote, what happens is you lose the perspective or the depth or of time and space between yourself and the immediate moment, right? So then you have that non-dualistic thing. Assuming that's persistent, then the monkey mind stops, but what starts instead is basically almost an immediate idea of shadow work, because it's almost like you have no skin then. You're literally in the present moment, moment to moment, and all of that stuff comes out because there's nothing really holding it back anymore. Your id, in essence, kind of just assaults you, and you have to just, on whatever level, start to deal with the shadow because there's just nothing holding it back anymore. Have you experienced any of that kind of thing, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I would say that I've had, I mean, my experience has some resonance with what you've described.
Mm-hmm.
So when I answered the question, yes, do I still experience monkey mind?
Mm-hmm.
I do, but not in the same way that I used to.
Mm-hmm.
What I find is that there are moments in life when my awareness of the non-duality of things, when my awareness of dualism as a veil on non-duality kind of slips away, I kind of forget it for a little bit. In the same way that a person who's a lucid dreamer might slip in and out of lucidity in a dream. It's like 1 second, oh, I'm dreaming. And they get so involved in things that they forget that they're dreaming. And then they go, oh, that's right, I'm dreaming. So if you're a lucid dreamer, you know what this experience is like. This a very similar thing has happened to me in the aftermath of the unitive experiences or the non-dual experiences that I've had. They don't happen as often. They don't last as long, but they still happen. And when I'm in one of those moments of non-lucidity, then my mind can start functioning again in the way that minds typically do when they don't have non-dual realization. Like flitting around and being anxious and jumping from this to that and trying to overanalyze things and
Got it.
And not relating to things from a position of love, and but more from a position of ego, and more about self-love than loving all, and self in the sense of the small s, which is a limited dualistic thing, trying to preserve that. But now what happens is just the rise of that kind of mental activity wakes me up. It's like, oh, okay, that's happening again. That means I kind of slipped into the dream of dualism there for a moment. And how can I kind of wake back up a little better? And so a lot of the practices that I have developed over the years are just about this moment to moment kind of awareness, self-awareness, and less about things like, performing rituals and doing really elaborate kinds of sitting meditations and imagery work and all those kinds of things, which I still do, but not as much, and they're not as important to this ongoing development in stabilized awakening or enlightenment or whatever we want to call it.
So,
Go ahead.
Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No,
I was just going to ask.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in terms of, you're talking about your inner self, inner consciousness and such, would you describe that as really inner light then? And if it is inner light, how would you differentiate that from an illusion or, it's your reality?
Yeah, what do we mean by light? Inner light. My second teacher used to talk about the word light really as the light of awareness. That for him, light was awareness. Consciousness can be aware and unaware. We talk about unaware consciousness. We use the term unconsciousness as if consciousness is something that can go away. But in this way of speaking, consciousness itself never goes away. Consciousness is always present. And it just has different modes. And one of its modes is unawareness, like dreamless sleep, for example. Consciousness still exists, but in dreamless sleep, it's just unaware. Unaware of sensory perceptions, unaware of any mental processes, those sorts of things. Brain activity, all that stuff. It's just unaware.
Good.
So, well, there's an example. I just slipped into unawareness because I was so busy trying to explain what I mean by this that I forgot where I was going.
So inner light. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yes, that's right. So thank you for bringing me back to that. Yeah. So the inner light is awareness, right? It's like a beacon of awareness. Where are you turning your attention? Where are you turning your awareness? That's light from this teacher's perspective. And so when we say Masonically that we're seeking more light, what we're actually saying is not that we're trying to receive something like light shined on us. What we're really trying to say is we're trying to become more aware. And then in your greater awareness, you begin to realize, okay, well, yeah, there's also awareness being directed from all these other directions and perspectives. Other human beings, for example, they're all shining their light. And sometimes our lights intersect with each other and our awarenesses overlap on something. And that gives us a better perspective on what that is, a better understanding when we share our light with each other.
I like that. Do you feel like on some level the whole idea of psychology or psychiatry as it stands is basically just trying to help us to be better dualistic creatures rather than really getting us to a better understanding of that light or of really getting into enlightenment?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, as a practitioner in the field, well, retired now, but as someone with decades of work in mental health and in higher education, I would say that, that largely mental health and education are about making us identify with and function more effectively in some ways in the two-dimensional dream of the one thing and the one non-dimensional thing. And but there are exceptions. There are schools of therapy that advocate moving into these higher states. For example, transpersonal therapy is one example. Psychosynthesis is another. You could argue that Jungian psychology is another. And there are educational systems and programs that that at least have a philosophical background that acknowledges the potential for transcendence. Yeah. So
And
one example for that would be like the Waldorf school, associated with Rudolf Steiner.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of based on a lot of the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. There's a philosophical
So like Landmark then and Est and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think you could argue that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good, Dave.
So how would you say individual inner work would impact the collective consciousness? And, especially with some of these groups and, even Freemasonry, how does that individual impact, the entire consciousness collective there?
Ripples in a pond. Each one of us is generating ripples in the great pond of creation. And, at different frequencies, different amplitudes. And the question is, what kind of ripples do we want to generate? Those ripples go out and they interact with other elements within this great sea of existence. And they create a kind of symphony of vibrations. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we, in our heart of hearts, how do we want to contribute to that symphony? What's the sound we want to produce? What do we want others to hear from us in that symphony? And that means really like searching our hearts and listening for what I was thinking of earlier, Alex, when you were talking about, is it in your heart? Is it in your third eye? Where is it? I was thinking about the story of the prophet Elijah and the still small voice. It wasn't the rumbling of the earth or the lightning flashes and stuff like that were the voice of God, but it was the still small voice. And so it's all of this work that we've been talking about doing, of trying to get into that place of openness and receptivity to realize the touch of the divine in our lives, is about, in this language that we're now using, hearing that still small voice and then sharing it like a prophet would do, singing it, putting it out there, sending those vibrations out into the world. And we can do that through, all kinds of different means. Some of us do it through writing and speaking. Others of us do it through acts of kindness and generosity. Paul in the New Testament talks about spiritual gifts. And every one of those things that he lists as spiritual gifts can be a way of radiating love in purer forms out into this great sea of existence.
Do you, so you espouse this contemplative sort of way, but contemplation is not meditation. It is also not necessarily prayer, right? So how would you define contemplation, just for the folks that don't really have that sense of what that is?
It's an important question, Alex. I'm glad you've asked it, because it's another one of those words that, depending on who you're talking to, it's going to mean something. It can very well mean something significantly different. I speak of contemplation in the way that it's typically spoken of in the academic world right now. And that is, it's used as an umbrella term to denote ways of intentionally focusing and using consciousness. It's intentional awareness. And so there's all kinds of things that are contemplative practices. Ritual is a contemplative practice. Meditation is a contemplative practice. Mindfulness is a contemplative practice. Dialogue is a contemplative practice. All of these things are contemplative practices. Now, one of the questions then becomes, what are the motives and the intentions that are driving those practices? And that's significant, because it shapes what the potential outcomes of the practices can be.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we probably should have asked that question right from the start.
We got around to.
Yeah.
So, and I'll ask this because, in my mind, I'm writing a book. I mentioned to you a little bit ago that I was doing that, about how men can become better men through the use of sacred spaces. Obviously what we're doing right now is a sacred space, right? So I would say, if Dave doesn't drop his stuff all over it. But
try not to.
Just put it down anywhere. It's fine. But the whole idea, Dave's burning incense. I do that too, and I'm sure we all do to some extent to create a certain atmosphere that can be done. And I guess it's with the idea of sacred space is a workshop, right? So it's a way to use it as a doing to create change within ourselves, however we're going to do that. How does contemplative practice create that sacred space for within?
Well, at an individual level, what I do, I have practices that I do here just on my own in my home. I have a little dormer window nook up here on the second floor of the house that is curtained off, and that's where my oratory is. That's where I do my prayers and meditations and my personal rituals are in there. And just looking at the curtain, I'm looking at it right now. Just looking at that curtain automatically starts to shift my consciousness, because I've got this habitual kind of reinforcement that says, okay, consciousness is changing. I'm moving in there to change consciousness, and consciousness is already changing as I move into there. So that also happens at a group level. It's like, even with a Masonic lodge where the guys are not thinking about any of this contemplative, some Masonic lodges, many Masonic lodges, nobody's talking about contemplative stuff, even though it's mentioned in the ritual.
Right.
Nobody's talking about meditation. They're not talking about sacred spaces. And yet their mind is already changing as they approach the lodge building, and as they cross that threshold into the lodge room. There's already a set of expectations about what are you going to be doing with your mind? How are you going to be acting with your body? What kinds of emotions are and are not appropriate in this setting? Those all changing consciousness. And, we defined contemplation or contemplative practices as intentional changes in consciousness, intentional changes in awareness. And so that's just kind of built into the way our minds work and in the way we interact with others. Now, if you start really getting intentional about that and paying attention to the technology of contemplative practices and being intentional about how you use them and understanding what their effects ideally can be, then that just magnifies. It's like you've plugged in the amp, for the guitar at that point.
Can you talk a little bit about more what that actually means? Or what is the technology of contemplative practice in this sense?
So, for example, if people know that, okay, when I'm in ritual, when I'm doing ritual, it helps for me to have an understanding of what these different symbols and these different instruments in the ritual represent in a spiritual sense and what they represent in a psychological sense. If I'm aware of that, and I'm also aware of what kind of effects that this ritual is supposed to be generating on the people that are participating in it, on, if it's an initiation, on the individual that's receiving it, then those effects if we think about it carefully, if we can contemplate it, we recognize that there are going to be emotional energies that are associated with what we're trying to project and with what the effect is on the person that's receiving it or the other people in the ritual. And so that's actually like tuning in a frequency. Emotions are energies. They are emotive. They make things happen. And so the emotional energy that we're putting into the ritual has an effect on all the other people there. And so if we understand what that emotional energy ideally should be, and we can, through practice, learn how to call up that energy, feel it, and project it through our voice and through our bodies and actions, connected with the intellectual understanding, the philosophical, spiritual understanding of all of these things that we're interacting with, then you can see this is like just turning up the volume on what's going on in the ritual, what the ritual is designed to do. It's not just a set of motions that we have to go through. That's the volume's cranked down to almost zero if we're just going through the motions and mouthing the words. But when we plug in these other aspects of our thoughts and our emotions, we crank up the volume.
Would you then argue that, and not to put you on the spot here, and I'm not disparaging or saying anything negative, Alex is wincing over there. Would you say, especially in Masonry then, at the moment, too many guys are going through the motions and not turning up the volume? Because I've read, I love your blog and reading about the Chamber of Reflection. We have one in our lodge, which I feel like is just an amazing experience for everybody.
It's a must-have. Absolutely.
Yeah. But do you feel like we'd be better off returning to more of the observance lodges and that type of realm?
I think Masonry would fulfill the purposes it was designed for more effectively if we did so.
Yeah.
I would not say that that's the only thing about Freemasonry that's important, and that every individual needs to be as deeply committed and involved in that as like I am, right? I am deeply grateful for the fact that there have been Masons for generations now who have found something in the ritual worth preserving, even if they didn't find it worth contemplating at a deeper level. They didn't realize that they were actually performing contemplation when they were learning and performing the ritual and learning and regurgitating the catechisms, but they were. And it had a positive effect on them in some way. Everybody benefits in some way from those experiences. But again, it's about turning up the volume. I mean, or you could say it's like turning up the brightness on the TV screen. I mean, most of us really want to watch a broadcast, a video of some kind with the brightness turned down so low that we have to squint at it to see anything, to make out anything that's meaningful, that touches us in any way. No, we want that brightness turned up so that we can actually see what's happening, and have the volume turned up so we can actually hear what's happening. That's the difference that I'm advocating needs to happen in Freemasonry, and not just Freemasonry. There are other orders, some of them are well-known esoteric orders where that's not happening. People have kind of fallen into the practice of like going through the motions and mouthing the words, and they've got the volume down near zero.
And I would even argue that probably happens in church too. You see everybody just going through mass and they regurgitate the prayers or whatever they're supposed to say and do, but yet it's like ultimately when they leave, did they really reflect on what they were just saying or what they were doing?
Yeah,
probably not.
going through martial arts is a good example, I guess, of this. I've in Tai Chi, I've seen it happen a fair amount. People get into it, they become incredible practitioners. They've turned up the volume, right, as we're talking about. They've amped it up to a great extent. They move the chi. They do everything they need to do. They've got their jings and their everything else, but they started the whole thing from an ego position of how great I'm going to be when I do this, of how great my thing is. So they're trapped within that realm. And the reason at least in the system that I've seen, there is Li, which is the actual physical version of using something, right? So the pushing, the using of the body to do something. There's Qi, or I'm sorry, there's mind power, so to speak. There's spiritual power, which is on top of that, the third level. And then there's void, which they call it, which is sort of amorphous understanding, but there's basically like things like literally skipping through time to get behind somebody, or doing things that require almost supernatural type of abilities. And there's guys that I know that have been able to do everything except that, because they're fantastic at everything that takes control, everything that is regimented, everything that is allowed and concerns power and force and the doing of something. In void, there is no doing of anything. There's it almost does unto you and allows you have to let go into it, right? So, and I guess I'm getting back to my own limitations here. That letting go is a tough one. It's a really tough one because, and I spoke with a friend this morning who Dave knows. It's just like, how do you let go? How do you do these things of like being able to get into these things? And again, it's, one of my main guys that I learned from is Dr. David Hawkins, who spoke about devotional non-duality. But again, he wrote an entire book on letting go and what that means. So, it's a fascinating and maddening thing to do these simple things, which I guess if you don't do these, you can't do the better stuff. And I'm just drowning at the seashore instead of getting into the deep water. What would you, if you were to come up with a system, which I know you probably have already a system that you would recommend to the viewers or anything, would you have anything in particular that you'd want to point towards that would be helpful for stuff like that? Because I'm sure there's other people that would benefit from that.
Alex, are you speaking specifically of a system to help people get to that void kind of experience that you're talking about?
Yes, certainly, but also as a preliminary of just like being able to seek out somebody who can assist in that relaxation, that we were talking about.
Yeah. That can be really hard to do. It can be hard to find someone that feels trustworthy, that's qualified in some realistic way because they've actually done the work themselves, that they have also gone through kind of mentoring and coaching in their work. It can be really hard to find individuals like that. And this is one of the benefits of finding one of the esoteric traditions or systems or schools that's been around for a while, that, has some kind of a positive reputation for producing what you might call adepts. And then go ahead and, kind of signing on and putting yourself in that student position. If you're not interested in an organizational approach, then it can be even harder to find an individual to work with who can say, yeah, I can take you through that process without you having to, become all involved in this society or this fraternity or whatever. I suppose one of the ways of doing that is to look for the people out there who have websites or blogs, look for people who've written books, who write articles, who do podcasts, and just really, really carefully exercising your faculty of discernment to try to see who out there is it that seems to be the kind of person that your heart and soul naturally resonates with, and try to make contact, reach out. And there are a lot more of those kind of people that are willing to make themselves available than I think a lot than folks realize.
Really? Okay. That's great to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. They may have some limitations and say, hey, I'm definitely glad to be a consultant and a coach, but it's not something that I can do like on an everyday basis or once a week or whatever. And so you may have to work within their time limitations.
Sure.
But there are a lot of folks out there that are willing to help out and have, I would say, we have a legitimate background for providing that kind of assistance.
Got it.
Yeah. But they could be hard to find, even though there are more out there than we know. I will say that, but they could be hard to find.
I guess you don't have to go to Nepal necessarily or someplace like that to.
Well, just call Arendelle and talk to Elsa, and you can let it go, Alex.
I guess I don't know what all that means. Okay,
it's a Frozen reference.
I'll ask my niece when I see her later on today.
There you go.
She's big into Frozen. Do you? You mentioned before that, and we don't typically get into Freemasonry for a bunch of reasons, because obviously, we're all Masons, but there's things that obviously we can't talk about publicly to folks outside the fraternity. But you did mention that there is, at least in your mind, what the original understanding of Freemasonry was sort of there to do. And I think we could probably talk about that with some clarity, sure, without infringing upon any of the stuff we can't talk about. So what in your mind was that idea, that mission of Freemasonry, at least originally?
Yeah. I think Freemasonry was meant to be initiatic,
mm-hmm,
transformative, and to lead individuals and groups of individuals to a realization, to a deeper awareness of their oneness with the divine and each other. That's what I think it was meant to do. When I say initiatic, I mean change the direction of my life.
Mm-hmm.
When I say transformative, I mean actually become a different kind of presence in this world, right? So change to become a different kind of presence in this world. And then all of that facilitating me becoming more in harmony, more in tune with the divine, recognizing my connection with the divine, and therefore with each other human beings, and therefore being a more effective presence of the divine within the world.
Wow. That'd be really good. Have you seen it do that in any meaningful way currently? I mean, in certain areas where it has succeeded in doing that exact thing?
Yeah, I can think of some lodges that I would say are probably more effective along those lines than the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think of plenty of individual Freemasons who that has been the effect of their experience, their participation in Freemasonry.
That's great. That's very heartening to hear. I mean, I think, as we say, on the individual level, I think there's a fair amount of New Jersey Masons that do a really good job of that. That's our main
pool of being able to chat about. I will not comment on what level the organization in New Jersey is doing, either good or bad. I don't think it's my place to discuss that. Certainly not among non-Masons, but even though I think obviously there are plenty of efforts and programs and things that I think are extraordinarily worthy in the smaller microcosms to which I've been a part of that I could speak to and I could say, good job. And then say that I think the larger organization is trying its best to meet certain challenges of the modern day. We'll see how that goes over the long term. It'll be an interesting thing to see. Dave, you have any more burning questions you want to put to our guest?
Well, so circling back,
okay,
those entities you were speaking about within, kind of the gatekeepers, the dimensions, whatever, when you're going up the ladder, could they be misconstrued possibly as aliens or some other type of entities like demonic or, jinns, whatever folklore is out there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And I think, different cultures have different ways of relating to these beings because we can't, at least ordinarily, see them with our physical senses and interact with them through our normal means of interacting. And even if we could, and sometimes it appears that it does happen, I think they present themselves to us in ways that are culturally relevant. They learn how to speak our language, so to speak. Exactly, what their nature is and who they are, I think is mysterious. But I think traditions provide us meaningful ways of interacting with them. For example, my background has given me a lot of interaction with what I call the Archangel Raphael, just as an example. Well, do I think that Raphael really looks the way that I imagine Raphael, that I visualize Raphael? Do I think that Raphael really has the name Raphael at some, level of personal identification? Yeah, that's my real name. I can't answer those questions. What I can say is that this mysterious entity and I can relate to each other through that name and through that imagery, that those are effective means of connection between us and communication between us. And so this is another reason why I think traditions are so important, is because they provide time-tested means of interacting with these other entities. Just one example of things that are time-tested through tradition and why traditions are valuable.
Sure. Thank you for that. And here's another question that I've written out. So how do symbolic languages impact consciousness? And is there a way to speak in symbols internally? And when I say, the symbolic languages like alchemy, certain things of folklore, like you're alluding to, I guess mathematics in some degree, and others, astrology.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because I was about to ask, is there a non-symbolic language? I think one of the things that happens is, every language, if we just think of like literal languages, English, German, Spanish, Japanese, every language has its strengths and weaknesses. Every language is better at doing some things and not as good at doing other things. And you can find a different language that is better at doing those things that the other language is not so good at. Every language carries with it certain expectations and rules about how they work. And those rules are effective in facilitating communication between people that use that language, right? So the same thing is true for these different languages that we find within the mystery traditions, like the language of alchemy and how it has been used for now psychospiritual development, and has apparently always had a spiritual element to it. But certainly in the 1800s, maybe you could even, and I would even argue from the 1600s on, that language has been a very powerful form of communication, not only between individuals trying to conceptualize and talk about their journeys of initiation and transformation, but also as a way of conceptualizing how initiation and transformation can work. The language of Freemasonry, the operative Masons' tools and building materials and techniques. There's another language that can be very effective once we get enough people speaking it and understanding, what's really being communicated through that language. So I think all of these languages have value, and each of them has their own kind of area of expertise and special talent and ability. They interconnect with each other just like real human languages do. And to some degree, we can say that they're all manifestations of just the primal instinctive drive toward language. Just like we have a primal instinctive drive toward transformation. And so it's just different circumstances in which those drives arise and begin to manifest determines the kind of languages that get developed for how they're expressed and facilitated, for how that those processes of initiation and transformation are expressed and facilitated.
So let me ask you this. Obviously, there's certain limitations to all these languages, and we even have other languages like Enochian, for instance, the language of the angels, quote unquote, ostensibly, as it's said. But I'm surprised that at least I haven't seen it. I've heard it mentioned once as possibly the language of the birds or something like that it was called. It was sort of like the pre-Diluvian language, pre-Babel, where it was like before the Tower of Babel, when we all unified in that. But no one really, I haven't seen any hope or any sense of restoring that language or that, the possibilities of sort of moving in that direction on some level of another unified possibility of that, other than Esperanto, I think, or maybe something like that, which has its own limitations, I'm sure. But do you have any ideas about that at all? That sort of pre-Diluvian language or anything that was around at that time?
Yeah. I suspect that language has kind of arisen organically in different places and different times. It has emerged organically. If we're just talking about spoken language, for example, that has emerged organically in different places and at different times. And of course, those times and places now being so far back in pre-recorded history that, we're hard pressed to say when and where and what they were.
Sure.
I know that linguists have done a lot of work to try to trace back to, what maybe the earliest known or deducible language could be. So like Proto-Aryan, for example, Proto-Indo-Aryan language. This is not something that I have any expertise in.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say from an esoteric perspective is that for me parallels the idea that was real popular in the Renaissance of the Prisca Theologia. The original truth about the original metaphysical truth about existence that was communicated directly from God to human beings.
It's like what Krishna said to Arjuna, I guess. Whatever that might be.
Yeah, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh to Adam,
Right.
for example. And so I think what the idea for me really gets at is what I was trying to describe earlier, and that is that we are innately endowed with an instinct, a drive to experience and express these dimensions of reality. We are innately driven, instinctively driven to develop and use language. That's one of the hallmark characteristics of human beings, for example. I wouldn't say it's just us, but certainly, I mean, we've got it in spades. And and similarly, there is this innate, instinctive drive to seek initiation, transformation, and some would call this the path of return, to rediscover our source, our connection with the source of everything and the oneness of all things. That's something deep, 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 deep down we know, although it's heavily programmed out of most of us, I think, these days. Mm-hmm. We've been taught to ignore it. We've been taught to poo-poo it. We've been taught that it's, a fantasy and a delusion, and yet we're driven to it. And some of us really consciously so. And so, is there an intersection? That's an interesting question between our drive for language and our drive for initiation, transformation, and the realization of oneness? Well, here's one thing we know. Without language, it'd be a lot harder for us to help each other go through the processes of initiation, transformation, and realization of oneness.
What about when it's almost like a language without language, like energetic transmissions, like, for instance, right? Whether we're talking about theurgy, if I'm getting the word right, or theurgy, you're accessing the divine or trying to master the below, quote unquote. So how does that sort of work in that sense? Because a lot of it is, and there's obviously different esoteric places where transmission is like the main part of the ritual, so to speak, right? Like even in Tai Chi, that exists where there's energetic transference outside of just learning the moves.
Yeah. Yeah, language beyond language. Well, for me, that would start to move into what we were talking about earlier with Plato and Noesis. Mm-hmm. And it's the direct intuition, which is so that experience when you know that you know something, but you can't put it into words just yet. It's there. It's there. And this is what people do. It's there. It's there. I just can't say it. For me, that's what comes to mind when you say the language that isn't language, or the language without language, the language without words.
Right.
It's, there's a communication happening. It's just going to take a while to unfold it and decipher it, right? And find the proper forms for it. Mm-hmm. So the language without language enters into awareness, and then we have to find the elements of the languages at hand that seem to fit it best and reveal what it has to reveal.
And that could be music, that could be art, that could be a million other things other than just necessarily the spoken word in that sense, or the written.
And absolutely. Yeah. It could be anything.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating.
Hmm.
Dave, any final questions for our friend? Because we want to be obviously respectful of his time, and I'm sure he's been very, very kind to give us the 2 hours today to chat with. And anything left you want to chat about?
Why do you feel there's a suppression and a mindset of teaching individuals not to focus on the divine and the esoteric?
Well, let me see if I can put it as bluntly and succinctly as possible. That the people in institutions that wield worldly power are essentially sociopathic. They don't give a shit about human beings. They see us as commodities to be utilized. They're not aware of the oneness. They're not aware of anything beyond consciously aware of anything beyond dualistic existence. And they're fully bought into the illusion of building up and protecting their egos at the expense of everything and everybody else. And they want to keep us away from the realization of oneness and unity because it threatens our submissiveness to their power.
Wow.
And our susceptibility, not just our submissiveness, but our susceptibility to their power. If we go contemplative and we begin to become more familiar with how illusion works, and then we're more capable of saying, oh, no, you're just the man behind the curtain over there spinning illusions and trying to keep us scared and afraid and divided against each other because you profit from it in your sense of being scared and afraid and divided from others.
That's beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for being you, being authentic and awesome and a friend and a brother. And with that,
thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. We're going to stop the recording, but I just want to hang around for a little bit afterwards if you have a moment. Until next time, this is Brothers of the Arcana. I am Alex Aldea.
I am Dave Fragno. God bless. Caritas.
Absolutely. And this has been Chuck Dunning. Thank you again.
Thank you.